Good morning and welcome to Departures. I'm very pleased to have with us Danilo Mandić, the author of a fascinating book, Gangsters and Other Statesmen, Mafias, Separatists, and Torn States in a Globalized World. Danilo, welcome to Departures.
Thank you for the honor of the invitation. It's good to be here.
Well, I can tell you, we love the book. The book helps to contextualize political science in a way that, unfortunately, a lot of other texts don't. It is bathed in context and detail and real life adventure, if you will, in explaining the role of gangsters in running governments and exploiting the urge to separate in various countries. And we're going to be taking you through the book. But before we do that, we give our authors the first crack at explaining the thesis of the book. So, Danilo, over to you.
So thank you very much for that. I suppose I tried to summarize it when I'm forced to summarize it in 2 words, the thesis of the book would be Mafias matter. They matter for contemporary state formation. They matter for many ethno-national and sectarian disputes, particularly what I call torn states, that is, nation states that have a significant internal endogenous challenger, violent or not, which is challenging their territorial sovereignty and their territorial integrity. Foreign states are countries that have pieces of their territory either under separatist control or partial separatist control, or that are at risk of having violent insurgencies make a piece of territory disputed. And so organized crime is this somewhat idiosyncratic phenomenon, which is in many ways deeply misunderstood, stigmatized, sometimes in ways that are not very helpful, but that are actually, as it turns out, central. Transnational smuggling of contraband such as drugs, narcotics, but weapons especially, across disputed borders is absolutely central to understanding how separatist conflict today happens in very different regions of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Western Africa, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and beyond. Organized criminal figures who enter politics, including formal parliamentary democratic institutions, gangsters who effectively become ministers, who become statesmen, who become major economic tycoons in the private sector, right, are often very important actors and very important stakeholders who, given the fragility of a lot of the states that have separatist challengers, end up having tremendous power and tremendous leverage, both in the direction of escalating conflict, raising the level of violence, raising ethnic tensions, and counterintuitively in the direction of alleviating conflict sometimes, lessening the incentives to violence through, for example, multi-ethnic smuggling, as is the case in several of the case studies in my book. So these are some illustrations of the overall thesis, which is that we have a neglected and often misunderstood non-state actor called organized crime that we need to give a lot more attention to understand separatism today and violent conflict today.
Well, I have to say that, for many of us in international law, the case of Kosovo and the West's recognition of Kosovo was an outlier. It was fairly shocking, and yet we sacrificed at the pillar of international law a government that you basically state was run by individuals heavily involved in human trafficking and the trafficking of body parts. It was your analysis of Kosovo was fairly astounding.
Well, I should hasten to point out that it's not my conclusion. I think it's fair to say that this is by now the consensus conclusion of major secondary scholarly analyses, secondary sources. It has been quite a while now since the Kosovo War, and particularly that aftermath of the Kosovo War, when the human organ trafficking racket you mentioned happened. And there are many question marks. There are many question marks as regards the scale, as regards the volume, as regards the various witness testimonies. Many things, as often happens in criminological attempts to understand such extraordinary episodes, are unclear. But there is by now a consensus, given the Dick Marty report, given various Western observers, I should add, not crazy Serbian or Albanian nationalist propaganda sources, but reliable, relatively objective and credible sources. If you attempt, as I do in the book, to take a kind of impartial synthesis of the available, credible, objective sources, I think it's inevitable to conclude that the Kosovar separatist movement was, to a significant extent, criminalized, and that this organized criminal structure emerged, was there before the major escalation of the war in 97, 98, 99, was absolutely formative during the NATO intervention, was absolutely formative in displacing non-criminal, non-violent alternatives within the Kosovar nationalist movement, and persisted after the war was over, well after the war is over, by spilling over into Kosovar state institutions. When we say state institutions, these are of course disputed, and this is part of the controversy in studying separatist movements. But there is no doubt that the overlap between the criminal underworld and the political elite that, for better or for worse, emerged when Kosovo acquired the major attributes of state, as sociologists say, as it began its state formation process. There is no doubt that there was tremendous overlap between the political and economic elites and the organized criminal scene. And when I say tremendous, if you look, for example, at the KLA leadership, it is overwhelmingly 85% or so was copy pasted from the Drenica group, which is a classic organized criminal mafia structure. Now, all of what I said does not in any way discredit the perfectly legitimate right of Kosovar Albanians to self-determination, nor does it prejudice necessarily American foreign policy and its failures and crimes and mistakes and also positive attempts, nor does it in any way justify Serbian repression in Kosovo, which often took the form of ethnic cleansing, nor does it absolve the Milosevic regime, which was itself deeply criminalized. So I mentioned this, Robert. Sorry, just to finish the thought, because when you mentioned at the beginning that it's treated as an exceptional case, that it's treated as as kind of sui generis, I have to confess to you that I also, beginning this work, which was first my dissertation, thought that it was indeed unique, that Kosovo is unique in having this bizarre elective affinity between the organized crime and the separatist politics. And one of my great surprises and discoveries, which the book you kindly mentioned goes over across 14 cases, is that Kosovo is, so to speak, not unique at all. That this is a typical pattern for separatist cases across East Europe, across the post-Soviet space, across West Africa, and across the Middle East.
Well, I mean, that's why I think your book is so important, because you colorize state analysis, which is black and white, and you've injected color into it in 14 cases, because you actually empower the analysis by talking about some of the real life players and some of the unfortunate real life events that trigger separatism or that have motivated some of these separatist urges, or in the case of Georgia and Ossetia, you portray the Georgian apparent attack on a mafia location as, in fact, perhaps the stupidest exercise of Georgian foreign policy, because they brought down what was an inter-ethnic economic miracle and damaged themselves and furthered an ethnocentric divide in their region. So I think the book is very important. I would tell you that we just had an interview with the author of a book called Roadblock Politics, who also presents a completely different view of the state, especially in Africa, talking about the focus on roadblocks. And he makes a farce out of the whole concept of conflict minerals and how the West is going about dealing with it. But I have to say, one of the other parts of the book I need you to explain to our listeners is your analysis of Ukraine. We are here in the United Kingdom, basically acting as if the Ukraine is the bastion of saints and holier than thou freedom fighters. And your book presents quite a different picture. And I'd like you to flesh some of that out for our listeners.
Yes, I will try. I have to say that I spent the summer in Ukraine, traveling up and down, or better to say east to west. So I was everywhere from Kramatorsk to Kharkiv at a moment when Kharkiv was not, where the front line was painfully close to where I was, as well as in Kiev and Lviv across the country. And I have to say that one of the big surprises for, I think, not just me, but many of my colleagues who have been following these two Russian separatists, highly criminalized, kind of Kafkaesque cages known as the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics. I am someone who has been following those for both professional research, ethnographic reasons, as well as personal reasons for a great number of years. I was smuggled into the DNR in 2017, and that was quite an ethnographic experience. Smuggled, of course, because, for example, to get in and out of DNR up until about a year ago, when the checkpoints were closed, you have to stand in line for some 30 hours. Old age pensioners are mostly standing in line there, moving back and forth, and sometimes they have to go to the restroom, and they wander off into the minefield to go to the restroom because there is, of course, no toilets. And then they accidentally step on the mine and get blown up while waiting for 30 hours to cross into the cross. So that's that kind of, it's an extremely, it's a prototypical gangster separatist statelet, which delivers not on governance or on legal standards or anything resembling human rights. And one of the tragedies of that population caught under the Russian occupation is, of course, that they are significantly hostages, and they are caught in between a rock and a hard place. The Russians treat them as hostages, the Russian military and the Russian military separatist proxy forces there. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian nationalist wing, which of course now is, so to speak, stronger than ever. The right-wing extremist tendencies within Ukrainian nationalism are very dangerous, and they are the best thing that ever happened to them, in a sense, was February 2022 and the Russian invasion. They treat those people as traitors and as potential terrorists and as suspicious agents and so on. And so, yes, Andrew, Robert, rather, the situation is much less Manichaean than a lot of our analyses are today. And it's a lot less Manichaean than the analysis was prior to February 2022. And we need to remember that this war has been going on since 2014. It is incorrect to talk about this war as beginning in February. For millions of people, this war has been going on for 8 years, and those people have been neglected, especially by the EU-oriented, Anglophone, kind of English-speaking, westernized kinds of people in Lviv and Western Ukraine, disproportionately in Western Ukraine, who tend to be our go-to audiences and who tend to be disproportionately shaping our perception of that war. And so, I apologize for the digression. To go back to your question, so yes, I paint a picture of the criminalization, not just of the separatist movement, I think I've been clear on that just now, but also on the criminalization of the Ukrainian state apparatus itself in the post-Soviet period. And I argue, building, of course, on the secondary material and on the archives and on the data, of which there is considerable data, on the question of, in particular, the criminalization of the arms industry in Ukraine. I argue that Ukraine's situation as regards its domestic mafias, not the ones that are the so-called rebel mafias, as I call them, rebel mafias inside the separatist territory fostered and nurtured by Russia, but internally to the Ukrainian state apparatus, that particular arms smuggling mafia was a major reason that the Ukrainian state was made incompetent and impotent to deal with its various separatist challenges, including the Crimea story, as well as the Donbas story. So we have to remember that Ukraine inherited by some estimates, it essentially inherited 30% of the Soviet military industrial complex, okay? And between 1992 and 1998, just in those 6 years, the estimate is that something like $32 billion, 32 billion American dollars of military assets simply vanished in that 6 years. There are estimates that say that for every $1 of legal arms exports coming out of Ukraine in this period, something like $2.5 were illegal. That is to say, for every legal dollar in this industry, another 2.5 were in the black market, gray market. Now, there are different ways to analyze what kind of market that is exactly, but it's certainly not doing any good to Ukraine's capacity to become a kind of rule of law, democratic, consolidated state, which has the capacity and the leverage to incorporate its separatist challengers as opposed to fighting a very costly war with them. Just to give you one more statistic, in mid-1990s, there was a peak in the arms outflow, Ukraine being a major arms as I'm sure your audience knows, major arms exporter, weapons exporter, right? And if you look at the peak year in the mid-1990s of arms exports, peak arms exports year out of Ukraine, 20% of the weapons export transactions were being carried out legally, meaning by entities that were recognized as legal registered enterprises with licenses to do that kind of work. 20%, which means that 80% at the peak of the arms outflow was being done by entities that are not even registered. Now, I know that I'm speaking to people who are much better versed in law than I am, but to go back to an earlier observation you made, right? Those kinds of data, which I tried to synthesize from every place you can in the book, indicate that we have a lot of work to do in conceptualizing what are we talking about when we talk about this state or that state, that a lot of what we assume is a kind of copy-pasted model of the state in Western Europe or the state in the United States or the state in Australia, for example, copy-pasting that kind of consolidated rule of law, division of powers state model onto something like Ukraine or something like Senegal or something like the former Yugoslavia is a tremendous mistake. Because when you look at the disjuncture between the legal sector and the informal shadow black/gray market economy, if you look at the disjuncture between the legal state enterprises and what they do on the one hand, and quasi-legal and completely black market illegal state enterprise activity on the other hand, you begin to see that the stuff that appears in the kind of organizational charts of typical governments and typical state enterprises is only a small part of, marginal sometimes part of the story. And that the real org chart we need to look at, so to speak, is this organized criminal org chart.
And I want to just interrupt you to say that I think that's one of the reasons this book is so important, because you know, the way you describe Transnistria in Moldova, I mean, it's just shocking as hell.
It's another example. Yeah.
These mafia statelets exist. But what's killing us is we're spending tens of billions supporting Ukraine, rightly or wrongly, but you describe it essentially as a mafia state. And my question to you is, for a mafia state, Ukraine is doing pretty well at keeping its shit together and taking down Russia in a very dramatic way. So it appears quite functional. So are you saying that that is a, you know, we have strong governance coming out of nowhere in Ukraine because of Western influence, or how do you explain this dramatic showing of Ukraine?
So it's difficult to explain, and it's tremendously surprising. I don't think many people saw, and part of the surprise of the Ukrainian military spectacular performance is that anybody who had analyzed the situation knew about the level of corruption and the kind of structural weaknesses of the Ukrainian military. There were various episodes of kind of smuggling with the enemy and so on that were very significant and seemed to be the tip of the iceberg and so on. I do, however, want to correct you. I do not refer to any of my cases as mafia states. The phrase mafia states was coined by a colleague of ours in foreign affairs to refer to Kosovo. And many people use this phrase to describe various, if there's any candidate to literally be described as a mafia state, it would be something like Kosovo. But Ukraine, I do not describe that. I have rather a typology. And this typology basically tries to capture two dimensions, two patterns that happen in this overlap between weak states, states under separatist threat, foreign states on the one hand, and organized crime on the other. One dimension is whether or not organized crime is partial or impartial. Namely, some organized criminal enterprises, like the one you mentioned in South Ossetia, is impartial, meaning it does not care, does not have a dog in the fight between the two sides of a war, the two sides of a separatist conflict. Other organized criminal enterprises are decidedly partial. They are supporting one side. They are smuggling weapons exclusively to one combatant or one belligerent, one political side of the collective violence, right? That's one important dimension. How partial are the organized criminals? Another very important dimension is the question of state dependence. Namely, some organized criminal enterprises, like the one in Ukraine that I was referring to, are decidedly very state dependent. They are embedded. They are inside the state apparatus. In the case of this arms smuggling mafia within the Ukrainian state, it was a sight to behold in the 1990s and well into the 2000s and up to the 2010s. That does not mean that Ukraine is a mafia state. It means that there are arms smuggling mafias embedded inside the state apparatus that are very destructive of the Ukrainian state's capacity, and that are more than corruption. Yeah.
But let's be clear. You described Yanukovych as a violent criminal, and he was the leader of Ukraine up to a number of years ago.
Yes, he was.
And he was a violent criminal. And you described the rest of the Ukrainians as, very much involved in these sort of mafia clubs and activities. I mean, we all know Ukraine is fairly corrupt, but you portray it that way in the book. And, the one point I would make that you don't focus on as much as I thought you might in the book is that one of the state sponsors of these mafias could be Russia. If you look at some of the connections, nothing to do with yet, perhaps, with what's going on in Africa, but when we look at Ossetia, when we look at Transnistria, when we look at Ukraine, when we look at many of these countries, Russia sponsors these types of activities because it is destabilizing, because it is in their interest. They don't want to see peace break out between Georgia and Abkhazia, Georgia and Ossetia. They want this strategy of tension and trouble.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I should have maybe emphasized that more. I certainly go into that in the book, including in the case of this very colorful gangster character called Rinat Akhmetov, who is in many ways responsible for the ascendancy of Yanukovych to the presidency. The Akhmetov clan, as I call it, not as I call it, as the literature has well documented it is a classic mafia, and mafias in general, the ones that get anywhere in these kinds of conflicts, tend to have state sponsorship. In this case, Russian, yes, certainly the Russian remnants of as you know, the Russian Federation inherited from the Soviet Union hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of KGB agents. And a lot of this, the rubble, as one scholar says, of the Soviet Union was the building block of the post-Soviet republics, including Georgia that you mentioned, and Moldova that you mentioned, and Ukraine that you mentioned. And so when you're building with these building blocks, it shouldn't be surprising that we get what one famous study called violent entrepreneurs, right? That of course you're going to get gangsterism in all the privatization schemes, in all the major political power brokers in the localities, that you're going to have daylight robbery. And Akhmetov is not necessarily exceptional in that regard, but you're absolutely right that a lot of these organized criminal enterprises in the locality would not get very far and would have nowhere close to the leverage that they end up having without significant geopolitical cross-border clout. Because you remember, a lot of the wealth that is created is through transnational, transborder smuggling. And so the role of diasporas, for example, ethnic diasporas, whether you're looking at Kosovo Albanians vis-a-vis Albanians in the Republic of Albania, or whether you are looking at the Russophone or Russian populations in some of the Donbass vis-a-vis Russians in the Russian Federation, or whether you're looking at the connection between South Ossetia, which is formerly in Georgia, and North Ossetia, which is, as you know, formerly in Russia. Those cross-border, cross-national connections are absolutely crucial, and they are the oxygen that these mafias thrive on. And so it's to be expected that the Kremlin was central both in the case of South Ossetia and in the case of Donbass. I just want to add one small kind of, not even a correct, but a footnote to what you summarized very well, and that is to say that countries like Ukraine are very, very big and very, very complex, and it is not a contradiction to have, on the one hand, a arms smuggling mafia embedded within the Ukrainian state apparatus, and simultaneously, notwithstanding, to have, on the other hand, Russian-supported, Kremlin-nurtured gangster separatist enterprises in Donetsk, in Lugansk, and above all in Crimea. The story of Crimean post-Soviet politics is completely incomprehensible without a dive into the mafia criminal clans that dominate the politics of Crimea while it was under Ukrainian sovereignty and after it was annexed by the Russian Federation. And so those things coexist, and they don't necessarily contradict each other.
With an ethnic overlay, we might add, in Crimea.
Certainly. Oh, Crimea is in a sense an outlier and should not necessarily be conflated with the Donbass, both in the question of ethnic heterogeneity.
We have the Cossacks in a big way in Crimea, but we don't have much time, but I want to talk about another country close to my heart, which is a country I've been in since I was a boy, which is the tragedy that is today's Nigeria, where we have a southern mafia. In fact, I would say dozens of southern mafias living off the oil in the Niger Delta. And in the north, we have Boko Haram, the Islamic fundamentalists, and between the two groups, tearing the country apart. Now, Russia is getting into Africa, as you know, in a big way because of the vacuum the French are leaving. But you can't blame the Russians for what's going on in Nigeria. That is a mix of big man politics, as you describe, the instrumentalization of these mafias by some of the big players, one of whom's running for president now. And that's a tragic situation. But indeed, the mafias in Nigeria, to some extent, are blended into aspects of governance.
Yes, and I suppose this is one of the most controversial aspects of my book that I find myself arguing with area specialists about, and that is to say that Boko Haram and that insurgency in northern Nigeria more generally is, to a significant extent, a separatist movement par excellence. That it is not necessarily about the Islam, that it is not necessarily about the terrorism, that these are classic, so to speak, mass mobilizations of the sort we are familiar with from other separatist movements of the world, and that there's a kind of misunderstanding because we over-focus and over-fetishize the question of the sectarian division and the question of the terrorism as a tactic. But I argue that if you start to understand Nigeria generally, and northern Nigeria, Borno State in particular, as a separatist case, a lot of windows open up. And I think we begin to see that the tragedy of Nigeria is the classic tragedy of countries like that, where they just happen to be, transnational crime is one of globalization's worst products, because it creates these kind of toxic swamps of corruption and violence and insurgency, right? And the tragedy of Nigeria is that it has these disputed, very weak borders, and they are right at Nigeria's geographic position is right at the intersection of major regional smuggling conduits, migrant smuggling conduits, right? Arms smuggling, and narcotics smuggling in Western Africa because of Nigeria's centrality, because of Nigeria's power regionally. It just so happens that it is smack dab in the middle of these regional and globalized rackets. I mean to say, I emphasize this because it's not just about Nigeria endogenously. The Boko Haram story and the separatism more broadly, historically in Nigeria, is significantly a story of the whole region and the globalization of organized criminal smuggling in the post-Cold War world. And in that sense, Nigeria has the same tragedy as, say, Kurdistan does, or as Kosovo does, as other separatist regions do. Borno State is much more like they are, because the separatists in North Nigeria and the government, which is trying to crack down on the separatists, are both very well positioned to profit from the regional smuggling opportunities. We're talking about, conservatively speaking, tens of billions of dollars in black market profits. And as you know better than I do, and as area specialists know, billions of dollars mean a lot more in West Africa than they do in, for example, Harvard Square. Massive armaments, massive drug narcotics profits to be made, and not to be forgotten, massive pools of mercenaries, young men, gangs, thugs for hire, right, are irresistible to many aspiring insurgents, including the Boko Haram movement, right? So the point is that separatist agitation, separatist mobilization and the mafia profiteering go hand in hand. And when you have the kind of geography and the kind of size and the kind of regionalization that Nigeria has, if you have the kind of neighbors that Nigeria has, neighbors like Niger and Mali, right, which are also deeply relegated to organized criminal interests, right?
And the Russians the Russians are moving into those two countries.
Yes. I don't focus as much on Russian influence in West Africa, but
it's just beginning. But they're there and they're growing. But look, we're way out of time. I want to just thank you for firstly a very enjoyable discussion. But I have to say, Gangsters and Other Statesmen is a book that we highly recommend to every listener, because I think you really add a portrayal of the state that is lacking in a lot of the literature. We really commend you for this book, and hope you will let us know about your future undertakings, and we'd love to have you back at some point. So thank you for this really outstanding and original work.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's been a pleasure.